Hello, and welcome back to our Intermediate Financial Accounting class. This is our discussion of the conceptual framework and about GAAP and the basics of the rules that form the foundation of everything else we're going to talk about throughout this course. So in our last segment, we talked a little bit about why this stuff is important. We talked about the three key objectives. We discussed one of our key concepts, and we set up the basics for how financial accounting fits in with the rest of the accounting profession. Okay, and the information that it provides both at the bookkeeping level and as financial accountants, where we're actually providing some key information. Okay, so with that, we're going to continue on with our discussion by talking about GAAP and where GAAP comes from. Now, you probably remember that GAAP stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. Usually at this point, I ask my students, who has to follow GAAP? And they stop for a minute, they think about it, and they talk about publicly traded companies. Well, it's also all these other companies. Everybody follows it, is the right answer. Everybody follows GAAP except for small mom and pop businesses that are just using their checkbook. But everybody else follows GAAP. Why? Well, because if the regulators don't want it, and investors don't want it, or the SEC doesn't require it, then there's still a banker that wants it, or the investment guru that wants it, or an angel investor, or somebody else that wants to see GAAP financial statements. That's why we talk about this not as publicly traded accounting rules or legal liability rules. We talk about them as being generally accepted. Why? Because everybody uses it. So they're the rules that govern all of the basic transactions and the reporting of the financial statements. So it's both the financial statements and everything else that goes into that warehouse that we talked about in the last segment. Okay? So that's what GAAP is. And the next question then comes from, well, where do we get GAAP? GAAP, as opposed to like IFRS, is set up as a series of rules and normal practices, things that everybody's doing. But the official body that has the right to set GAAP is the SEC. So basically what happened, and here I'm going to try again with my wonderful artistic abilities to draw this out. So you can imagine here, this is the Capitol building. I had to tell you because you probably can't guess from looking at it. Okay, so basically the government gave permission to the SEC, and we used a little office building here to represent the SEC, to regulate financial reporting, at least for publicly traded companies. Okay, so the government gave power to the SEC. The SEC said, we're not going to do it. Instead, we're going to regulate that on to the FASB, and the FASB is a set of 7 board members. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We need one more. There we go. We'll give him a little hat just to be different. Okay, so we got 7 board members that make up the FASB, and they're the group that actually sets financial accounting rules now. Now, I normally ask, why don't we want the government setting financial accounting standards? And in a class setting, we have a bit of a discussion, and we can't do that here. So I'll just give you the quick answer. How many of you have ever had to fill out a tax form or a tax return? Okay, well, Congress sets those rules, and they're kind of a mess, aren't they? They're hard to understand, they're hard to do. Believe me, we do not want the government setting GAAP. It's much better that we have a group of accountants, academics, and other business professionals that form FASB, and they get to set these rules. And the SEC will sometimes nudge them and push them, but really it belongs to the SEC, or excuse me, really it belongs to the FASB to make these rules. Now, it hasn't always been FASB that has set up the financial accounting standards. It used to be a couple of other groups, and instead of going through these, let me again draw a picture, and I'll try to draw a little bit faster this time. Okay, but basically, let's just draw a timeline here. So, in about, let's see, up to about 1939, there was no GAAP at all. Companies reported the best way they knew how. I know this is shocking. And then, if you remember your history, and you may or may not, right about in here was the financial crash and the Great Depression. And Congress said, you know, this is, and the SEC and the accounting standards, the accounting groups said, this is not working. We can't just all set our own rules. So they put together a small group called the Committee on Accounting Procedure, the CAP. And I just love that. It's the cap setting GAAP. Well, I think it's funny. Anyway, okay, so this was our first attempt to set GAAP on our own. It was in 1939 to 1959 over here. And we tried to set some rules, and the rules were really flexible. There wasn't a lot of detail to them, but, you know, we did better than we had where there was no formal GAAP. And then in the late 50s, there was another, not quite the Depression, but a recession and some fiascos. And so we fired the cap, and we created the APB, the Accounting Principles Board. And they were much more formal. We're going to give them a top hat here. They're much more formal than the cap. And they set some really serious rules, and they regulated things quite a bit better. But then, in about the early 70s, 1972, 1973, there was another disaster. And you can probably imagine what happened, based on what we've already said. Yeah, they fired that group. And since they fired them, then they had to create a new one. And they created the FASB. And FASB has set more rules and more regulations than anybody else, so they're tired. Okay? But they have been the group setting GAAP ever since. And this is what typically happens in the history. Anytime there's a major disaster, we lose one accounting standards body and get a new one. With Enron and those disasters, it was the auditing group that got outed and a new group put in. But people tend to blame the accountants. And things change, and we get new sets of rules, and all sorts of stuff happens. Okay, but the basis for all GAAP, all of these bodies have a couple things in common, and one of those is the fact that they are all building on common practice. Okay, GAAP is built on a foundation of common practice. Now, why do we care? Well, we care for a couple of reasons. One, it's just interesting to know the history, and two, it's cool to know that some of those early rules we're still using because FASB hasn't produced new rules, and so the old rules, they stay in place. Okay. Now, by the way, before we go any further, I should mention this idea of who has the authority and the legal right to set GAAP versus who does set GAAP is another of our key concepts for this class, right? You need to be familiar with and know that the SEC has legal right, but the FASB has the general right and the permission from the SEC to do it. It's a key concept. Okay? All right, let's talk about another idea then here. Whoops. Sorry. Okay, so this is what we call the House of GAAP. And we don't see this picture very much anymore, but I think it's important that you understand kind of where we were. This is the way that we used to set GAAP. Okay? There were all these different groups. Everybody had authority to set some of it. So you had FASB setting, you had some old APB things, you had the Emerging Issues Task Force, AICPA, all these different groups setting GAAP, and it was a nightmare to try to find the right rules, okay? Because what you had this House of GAAP here. That's a U. And into this House of GAAP, you had old APB rules. You have the Emerging Issues Task Force. That's kind of a quick and dirty set of rules. We'll talk about FASB's process probably in the next segment. But you have FASB setting all these rules, and it takes a long time. So they created this other little body that sets rules in the interim. Okay, and so they were setting rules. And then, of course, you had FASB. And FASB was producing rules, but they were producing guides that became part of their rule set, and they had bulletins that were part of their rules, and then they actually had their standards, which were their official rules. So it was all this stuff, and it was impossible to figure out what rules should we follow and when do we do and what, and it became very, very challenging to find the rules. So in 2009, FASB took all of that from the House of GAAP and they created the Accounting Standard Codification. Okay? And this is now the official source of GAAP, according to FASB. We don't use all of these old things. We just go to one place, and FASB keeps it updated. They have a whole staff that keeps track of it. And another one of our key concepts is the idea that we now go to the ASC, and we get all of our key concepts from the codification. And it's a key idea and a huge step forward for all of us that we now have one place that we can go and get GAAP. So we'll end there, and I'll see you in a few minutes.